The locket cost him 400,000 credits, and it was the cheapest thing in the room. Orkan Vess had not come to the cradle exchange for a locket. He had come for the crown, a jagged circlet of fused glass supposedly worn by the last monarch of a species called the Vihenari, extinguished 11 centuries ago in what the histories politely called a correction. He had studied the crown's provenance for weeks beforehand, had arranged financing through 2 separate trade houses, had even, in a rare display of sentiment his colleagues would have found bewildering, imagined the exact corner of his gallery where it would eventually stand, beside the Vihenari funerary masks he had acquired 3 years prior, completing a display he had been quietly assembling piece by careful piece since before Ressa had ever come to work for him. Orkan collected extinctions. That was the whole of his reputation among the trading houses of the Thren ascendancy. The thing people said about him at gatherings, he was too important to skip and too bored to enjoy, that Orkan Vess owned pieces of 100 dead worlds, that his private gallery held more vanished cultures than the ascendancy's own archive, that if a species had ever been quietly erased from the galaxy's ledger, Orkan probably had a fragment of it sitting in climate-controlled glass somewhere in his tower. He did not win the crown. A rival house outbid him in the final seconds, and Orkan sat in his private booth above the auction floor feeling the particular hollow irritation of a man for whom losing was less about the object and more about being seen to lose. He was already reaching for his exit chime when the final lot of the evening scrolled up onto the display, tagged with the low, dismissive designation the auctioneers used for filler items nobody expected to sell for anything worth mentioning. Lot 214, Terran origin, species designation Homo sapiens, status, extinct confirmed culling record 7734B item, personal locket brass alloy engraved, provenance, recovered from debris field outer rim salvage. Orkan had, if he was honest with himself, no particular interest in humans. They were a minor entry in the culling record, one of nearly 900 species quietly removed from the galaxy's population ledgers over the last several centuries by the Choir, the ancient, faceless authority that decided, with a serenity nobody was permitted to question, which civilizations had grown too volatile, too unpredictable, too dangerous to their neighbors to be allowed to continue existing. Humanity had been culled decades ago, if the record was to be believed, their homeworld and colonies gone quiet within the span of a single season, their relics trickling into the black markets of a dozen sectors ever since, cheap and plentiful, the way the leftovers of any erased species eventually became. He should have let the lot pass. He very nearly did, but something about the locket's image on the display caught him in a way he could not immediately name, not its beauty because it had none particular to speak of, a simple oval of tarnished brass on a broken chain, its surface engraved with 2 words and a set of numbers that meant nothing to him. Something else. A pull, faint and strange, like the sensation of being watched in an empty room. 400,000, he said into the bid line, more to surprise himself than anyone else, and the gavel fell before anyone bothered to challenge him. His majordomo, a narrow-faced Thren named Ressa Ilvin, who had managed Orkan's gallery for 11 years, and had long since stopped being impressed by anything he did, looked over the delivery manifest that evening with open skepticism. "You lost the Vihenari crown to buy a piece of Terran scrap," she said. "For 400,000 credits. I want to make sure I understand the scale of the mistake before I file the paperwork." "It caught my attention," Orkan said, turning the locket over in his gloved fingers under the gallery's soft display lighting. "That's all. It doesn't need to justify itself further than that." "Most things you buy don't," Ressa said dryly, "and most things you buy also don't come with a provenance tag this thin. Outer rim salvage, no chain of custody before that, no auction history. For all we know, it fell off a garbage scow an hour before it hit the floor." "Then it was a garbage scow with excellent taste," Orkan said, and did not look up from the locket again for the rest of the evening. The engraving, once he had it translated through the gallery's linguistic archive, read simply, "To Ruth, who always comes home." Beneath it, a set of numbers that the archive flagged as an old Terran calendar date. Nothing more, a wedding anniversary or a birthday or some private marker of significance lost entirely to the 4 centuries, since it had last meant anything to anyone alive to remember it. He placed it in his private display case that night, in a quiet corner of the gallery reserved for items too small or too unremarkable to warrant a formal exhibit space, and he told himself, as he switched off the lights and retired to his upper chambers, that it was nothing more than a curious impulse purchase, a small mystery he would forget about within the week. He dreamed that night for the first time in 11 years. He did not, as a rule, remember his dreams. Thread physiology processed sleep differently than most species, cycling through restorative states with little of the vivid narrative dreaming other cultures described, and Orkan had gone the better part of his adult life without so much as a fragment of imagery surviving into waking memory. But that night he woke gasping in the gray hour before dawn with the unmistakable, disorienting sense of having just lived an entire lifetime that was not his own. A woman's hands, calloused and strong, gripping a rifle in a trench filled with mud and smoke. The specific, aching fear of waiting for a letter that did not come. A man's voice, warm and low, saying, "I'll come home, Ruth. I always come home." Moments before the dream dissolved into static and left Orkan alone in the dark of his own chambers, his heart's hammering against his ribs in a rhythm his physiology had no name for. He told himself it meant nothing. He was, by nature, a careful man, methodical in his collecting, unsentimental about the objects that passed through his hands regardless of the tragedies attached to them. One did not build a gallery of 900 extinctions by weeping over each individual relic. There was a reason for that unsentimentality, though Orkan rarely allowed himself to examine it too closely. He had been born the third son of a minor thread trading house, the kind of family that clawed its way into respectability one careful transaction at a time, and he had grown up understanding, long before he understood much else about the galaxy, that importance was not a thing a person simply possessed. It was a thing acquired, curated, displayed proof that you had climbed high enough above your origins that nobody would ever again mistake you for the boy whose father had once sold cargo manifests door to door across the trade ring to keep the family solvent. Every extinguished civilization in Orkan's gallery was, in its quiet way, another rung on that ladder, another proof of significance he could point to when the old insecurity crept back in during the small hours he never spoke of to anyone. He had not built friendships along the way. He had built a reputation instead, and told himself across 2 decades that the two things were close enough to the same purpose that the difference did not matter. Standing now in the gray hour before dawn, with his heart still hammering from a dream that did not belong to him, Orkan found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to measure, genuinely uncertain whether that had ever actually been true. The dream lingered through the following day in a way dreams were not supposed to. A residue of feeling that clung to him through 3 separate acquisitions meetings and a dinner with a trade delegation he barely remembered attending. He caught himself twice, reaching absently toward his chest as though checking for something that was not there, and it was not until the second time, midway through a tedious negotiation over a shipment of Vihenari pottery shards, that he realized what his hand had been searching for, the shape of a locket he did not yet own the right to wear. That evening, against every professional instinct he possessed, he found himself standing again in front of the small display case, looking down at the tarnished brass locket with something uncomfortably close to unease. "Orison," he said, addressing his gallery's cataloging intelligence, an artificial mind he had installed years ago primarily to manage inventory and appraisal records rather than anything resembling conversation. "Run a deep composition scan on Lot 214. The Terran locket. I want to know what's actually inside it. The scan took 11 minutes, considerably longer than the routine appraisal scans or Khan was accustomed to. And when the cataloging intelligence finally reported its findings, its usually flat administrative tone carried an edge that made or Khan go very still. I want to preface this by saying the reading may be an equipment malfunction, it said, but the locket's interior registers an active power signature. Faint, self-sustaining, and structured in a pattern I do not have a reference for in any manufacturing database available to me. There also appears to be a data architecture embedded within the casing, extraordinarily compact. And this is the part I would like flagged for your attention specifically. It appears to be actively monitoring ambient conditions. Temperature, proximity, vocal patterns. Sir, I believe this object has been listening to us since the moment entered the gallery. Orkan stared down at the small brass oval sitting so innocuously in its case, and felt the same strange pull he had felt on the auction floor, stronger now, insistent, less like curiosity and more like recognition. "Open it," he said quietly, carefully. "I want to see what's inside." The locket did not open the way Orkan expected. No hinge catch, no simple clasp. It was Ressa, arriving late to the gallery, and finding him still hunched over the case at an hour when he was normally long retired, who suggested pressing directly against the engraved surface rather than searching for a seam. And the moment Orkan's gloved fingertip made contact with the words to Ruth, who always comes home, the locket's casing shivered with a faint internal light and split cleanly open along a seam that had not existed a heartbeat before. Inside, where a portrait or a lock of hair might once have sat in an ordinary keepsake, there was instead a single crystalline node, no larger than a grain of sand, pulsing with a soft golden light that made both Thren and the room go very quiet. A voice filled the display room, not through any speaker or Khan could identify, but seeming to rise from the air itself, directly, intimately, in a language his translator struggled for a full 3 seconds to parse before finally rendering it into something close to Thren's standard. "Query," the voice said, calm and measured, carrying an unmistakable weariness that suggested it had asked this same question a great many times across a very long silence. "Is the war over?" "There is no war," Orkan said, once he had recovered enough composure to speak at all. "There has been no war involving your species in decades. You were culled, removed from the record. Your kind is extinct." The pause that followed felt, impossibly, like grief. "I am aware that my makers expected that outcome to be possible," the voice said finally. "I am a Sentinel-class personal archive, bonded to Corporal Ruth Calloway of the Terran 3rd Expeditionary, activated on the day of her passing to preserve what could be preserved, and if the worst came to pass, to wait patiently, indefinitely, for someone worthy enough to be trusted with what remains." A brief flicker of the golden light, almost like a held breath. "You are the first living intelligence to open this casing in 187 years. I would ask, before anything else passes between us, that you tell me plainly what kind of person you are, and what you intend to do with what you find inside me. I have very little else left to protect. I do not intend to lose it carelessly." Orkan Vess, who had spent 23 years building a career on the quiet, profitable business of collecting the remains of the dead, found himself standing in his own gallery at 3 in the morning, utterly unable to answer a question that should have been simple, because, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he did not actually know what kind of person he was. He gave the archive a name within the week, not out of sentiment, he told himself, but out of practicality, since referring to it as the Sentinel Unit every time felt unnecessarily clinical for something that spoke with the specific, weathered cadence of a person who had clearly loved someone very much. It offered its own suggestion before he settled on anything of his own. Keeper. It had been built, after all, to keep something. The name felt honest in a way Orkan found himself unexpectedly grateful for. Keeper did not immediately trust him, and Orkan respected that more than he expected to. Over the following weeks, in stolen hours between acquisitions meetings and gallery business, the archive doled out fragments of Ruth Calloway's life carefully. Testing him, he came to realize, the way a wary animal tests the hand offering food. A memory of her childhood on a Terran colony called New Meridian, sun-bright and ordinary, given freely. A memory of the day the choir's culling fleet arrived in her home system, given only after Orkan sat through the telling without once reaching for a data pad or checking the gallery's incoming acquisitions queue, proving, in whatever small way mattered to an intelligence built to judge character, that he was actually listening. She was not a soldier by inclination, Keeper told him one evening, its golden light pulsing gently in the quiet of the display room Orkan had begun visiting most nights now, alone, without quite admitting to himself why. She trained as an agricultural engineer. She wanted to grow things. But when the culling fleets began their sweep of the Terran systems, there was very little room left in the galaxy for people who only wanted to grow things. She picked up a rifle because someone had to, and she held a line at a place called the Meridian Gate for 6 days so that 11,000 civilians could reach the last evacuation ships. She did not survive the 7th day. I was activated in her final hour as she had requested, to preserve what I could of her, and of the coordinates she died protecting. There were other memories, offered more slowly, in the careful, testing rhythm Keeper seemed to have decided suited its own comfort rather than any urgency of Orkan's. A memory of Ruth as a young woman, laughing in a greenhouse thick with the green smell of growing things, her hands buried in dark soil up to the wrist, utterly unbothered by the mud staining her sleeves. A memory of the man whose voice Orkan had heard in that first strange dream. Her husband, Keeper explained. A supply logistics officer named Sam who had shipped out 3 months before the culling fleets arrived and never made it back to the Meridian Gate in time, though Ruth had waited for him until the very last evacuation transport lifted off without either of them aboard. A memory of grief so raw and unguarded that Orkan found himself, on more than one evening, sitting in silence long after Keeper's light had dimmed for the night, simply absorbing the particular ache of loving someone enough to keep hoping for them even after hope had stopped being reasonable. "You keep giving me the hard ones," Orkan said once, not quite an accusation, more an observation offered aloud in the quiet. "I am testing whether you flinch," Keeper admitted. "Most people, when confronted with grief that is not their own, either perform sympathy they do not feel or retreat from it entirely, uncomfortable with a pain too large to politely manage. You have done neither. You simply sit with it. I do not know yet whether that is because you have learned real compassion somewhere along the way, or because you have simply grown skilled at appearing patient. I find, the longer I watch you, that I am inclined to believe the former, though I confess I am not yet fully certain why." Ressa, for her part, had her own reasons for staying quietly, steadily loyal through the strangeness that had overtaken Orkan's gallery in those weeks, reasons she did not share with him until considerably later, aboard the freighter, in the long dark hours of the journey when there was little else to do but talk. Her own grandmother, she told him one night, had been a war orphan from a border conflict the Ascendancy's histories preferred not to dwell on, raised in a resettlement camp that had, in its own small and unglamorous way, been exactly the kind of quiet mercy that made the difference between a life continuing and a life simply ending. "I have spent 11 years managing your gallery of dead things," she said, not unkindly, watching the stars slide past the freighter's viewport, telling myself it was honorable work because at least somebody was remembering them properly. But there is a considerable difference, or con, between remembering the dead and actually saving the living. I would like, before I am done with this life, to know I did at least a little of the second kind. It was Ressa, in fact, who suggested the freighter's registration channels, and Ressa who quietly liquidated a portion of her own modest savings without telling him, in the days before departure, in case Orkan's considerable but not unlimited fortune proved insufficient to see the journey through. He did not learn about that particular sacrifice until much later, and when he did, it settled into him with a weight he suspected would take a very long time to properly repay. It was on one of those quiet evenings, weeks before the freighter or its journey had even been decided upon, that Keeper first spoke the word that changed everything. "There is one memory I have been reluctant to give you," it said, its golden light unusually still. "Not because it is painful, though it is that as well, but because once you hear it, you will no longer be a curious collector who bought a strange trinket at auction. You will be a man who knows a secret the choir has spent decades ensuring nobody ever learns. I need to be certain before I say it, that you understand what you are agreeing to carry." "Tell me anyway," Orkan said, and found to his own considerable surprise that he meant it. "I am telling you there were, as of the last confirmation I received before my activation, approximately 11,000 souls in cryogenic dormancy, guarded by a skeleton crew and a handful of automated defenses, in a system I am not yet willing to name aloud even in the privacy of this room. If this story has your full attention, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more, and drop a comment telling us what you think Keeper is about to reveal. We love reading your predictions, and some of you have gotten shockingly close before. Now, back to the story. Humanity was not entirely extinguished, Keeper said, once Orkan had settled back into stillness. The choir's culling fleets were thorough, but they were not perfect, and in the final desperate months of the Terran resistance, a coalition of surviving colonies and military remnants built something they called the Ark Protocol, a scattering of hidden refuges, cloaked and buried and seeded across a dozen unremarkable systems. The choir's records had never bothered to fully catalog, each one holding a small population of survivors in careful stasis, waiting for a day when it might be safe to wake them. Ruth Calloway did not die simply holding a gate. She died buying time for the last Ark transport to reach its hiding place undetected, and the coordinates of that Ark are the coordinates I have carried, sealed inside myself, for 187 years, waiting for someone the choir would never think to suspect. Orkan's mouth had gone dry. "You're telling me there are living humans, now, today, hidden somewhere in the galaxy?" "I am telling you there were, as of the last confirmation I received before my activation, approximately 11,000 souls in cryogenic dormancy, guarded by a skeleton crew and a handful of automated defenses, in a system I am not yet willing to name aloud even in the privacy of this room. Whether they remain undiscovered after nearly 2 centuries, I genuinely do not know. I have had no way to check. I have simply waited and hoped, and tested every hand that has come near this casing to determine whether it belonged to someone who might finally be trusted to check on my behalf." A pause, heavy with something that felt, in that strange golden light, uncomfortably close to pleading. "I have decided, Orkan Vess, that I am willing to trust yours. I would ask you to consider carefully what that trust is going to cost you before you decide whether to accept it." Orkan sat in the quiet of his gallery for a long time after that, surrounded by the careful, climate-controlled remains of 900 extinguished civilizations, and understood, with a clarity that felt like something breaking open inside his own chest, that he had spent his entire adult life curating tragedy without once asking himself whether any of it could have been prevented, or whether any of it deserved, even now, to be quietly set right. The trouble, as Orkan quickly discovered, was that possessing a secret the choir had worked for centuries to keep buried was rather different from simply knowing one. Within 2 weeks of Keeper's revelation, Ressa flagged an irregularity in the gallery's security logs, a query, routed through 3 separate shell accounts, requesting detailed provenance information on Lot 214 from an office Orkan recognized immediately and with a cold drop in his stomach. The Species Compliance Division, the quiet administrative arm of the choir's authority responsible for ensuring that culled populations remained, in the division's own bloodless phrasing, fully and permanently resolved. They don't send inquiries about scrap-value relics, Ressa said, standing in or Khan's private office with her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested she had already guessed at least part of what he was hiding from her. Not unless something about this particular piece has attracted attention it shouldn't have. Or Khan, what did you buy? He told her all of it. He was not entirely sure afterward why he chose honesty over the dozen more convenient lies available to him, except that Ressa had managed his gallery for 11 years with a loyalty he had never properly earned, and had certainly never properly thanked her for. And some part of him understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that a man could not ask someone to risk everything alongside him while still treating her as staff rather than as someone whose trust actually mattered. Ressa was quiet for a long moment after he finished, her expression unreadable in the way Thren faces so often were to those who did not know them well, and when she finally spoke, it was not with the fear Khan had braced himself for. 11,000 people, she said slowly, alive, waiting, and the only thing standing between them and staying that way is a locket you bought to spite yourself over losing an auction for a glass crown. She shook her head, something almost like a laugh escaping her despite the gravity of it all. You realize the compliance division doesn't investigate. They don't need to. If they've flagged this item, it means they already suspect what it is, and the only reason we're having this conversation instead of already being detained is that they haven't yet confirmed it's worth the resources to move on you directly. That window will not stay open long. Then we don't give them the chance to close it, Khan said, and heard, as he said it, the sound of a decision he had not consciously known he was making until the words were already out of his mouth. Keeper's response, when Khan explained what he intended, was cautious in a way that felt, for the first time since their conversations began, less like a test of his character and more like genuine concern for his safety. I want to be honest with you, the archive said, its golden light steady in the dark of the display case. The ARC protocol was designed with the expectation that whoever eventually retrieved these coordinates would be doing so at enormous personal risk. The choir does not forgive discovery of a successfully hidden population. If you move on this, and the division confirms their suspicions before you complete the journey, you will lose everything you have built, your gallery, your standing, very likely your freedom, possibly your life. I have watched you carefully across these last weeks, Khan Vess, and I believe, more than I expected to when this began, that you are a better man than the reputation you have spent your career cultivating. But I would not ask you to prove that at the cost of everything you are. The choice in the end has to be entirely your own. Khan looked around his private office. At the awards from trade houses he had never particularly respected, at the acquisition ledgers documenting 2 decades of profitable, careful, ultimately hollow collecting, at the reflection of his own face in the dark display glass, a face that had grown very good at looking important and had somewhere along the way forgotten how to look like it belonged to someone worth trusting with anything that actually mattered. The trouble, as Khan quickly discovered, was that possessing a secret the choir had worked for centuries to keep buried was rather different from simply knowing one. Within 2 weeks of Keeper's revelation, Ressa flagged an irregularity in the gallery's security logs, a query, routed through 3 separate shell accounts, requesting detailed provenance information on Lot 214 from an office Khan recognized immediately and with a cold drop in his stomach. The Species Compliance Division, the quiet administrative arm of the choir's authority responsible for ensuring that culled populations remained, in the division's own bloodless phrasing, fully and permanently resolved. They don't send inquiries about scrap-value relics, Ressa said, standing in Khan's private office with her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested she had already guessed at least part of what he was hiding from her. Not unless something about this particular piece has attracted attention it shouldn't have. Or Khan, what did you buy? He told her all of it. He was not entirely sure afterward why he chose honesty over the dozen more convenient lies available to him, except that Ressa had managed his gallery for 11 years with a loyalty he had never properly earned, and had certainly never properly thanked her for. And some part of him understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that a man could not ask someone to risk everything alongside him while still treating her as staff rather than as someone whose trust actually mattered. Ressa was quiet for a long moment after he finished, her expression unreadable in the way Thren faces so often were to those who did not know them well, and when she finally spoke, it was not with the fear or Khan had braced himself for. 11,000 people, she said slowly, alive, waiting, and the only thing standing between them and staying that way is a locket you bought to spite yourself over losing an auction for a glass crown. She shook her head, something almost like a laugh escaping her despite the gravity of it all. You realize the compliance division doesn't investigate. They don't need to. If they've flagged this item, it means they already suspect what it is, and the only reason we're having this conversation instead of already being detained is that they haven't yet confirmed it's worth the resources to move on you directly. That window will not stay open long. The days that followed took on a strange, doubled quality, Khan continuing to appear at trade dinners and appraisal meetings with all his usual practiced ease while, underneath that careful performance, he and Ressa worked quietly to prepare for a departure neither of them spoke of openly even within the gallery's own walls, uncertain which of the staff might, however innocently, mention something to the wrong ear. He liquidated assets in small, unremarkable increments, careful never to draw the kind of attention a sudden fortune shift might attract. He arranged for the more sensitive pieces of his collection, the ones representing species whose remnants, like humanity's, might still exist somewhere hidden and unconfirmed, to be quietly transferred into a private trust under Ressa's sole authority, a decision he made without fully examining why it felt so urgently necessary, except that some part of him had already begun to suspect he might not be coming back to claim them himself. Twice in that final week, Khan noticed a figure lingering near the gallery's public entrance longer than any ordinary patron reasonably would, a Thren in unremarkable civilian dress whose eyes tracked Khan's movements with a stillness that felt entirely too deliberate to be coincidence. He said nothing to Ressa about it, not wanting to add fear to a plan already heavy enough with risk, but he found himself, that night, sitting beside Keeper's case long past the hour he normally retired. "You are frightened," Keeper observed not unkindly. "I am," Khan admitted. It was, he realized, the first time in longer than he could remember that he had said the word aloud to anyone, let alone meant it. "I have spent my whole life being careful specifically so that I would never have to feel this particular kind of frightened, and now I find I would rather feel it than go back to the alternative." That, Keeper said softly, is very close to the exact sentence Ruth said to me the night before the Meridian Gate. I did not expect to hear it again in this lifetime. I am glad and I am sorry in equal measure that I have. It paused, its golden light dimming and brightening slowly like something breathing. She was frightened too that night. She told me fear was not the opposite of courage. It was simply the price courage asked you to pay up front before it let you keep the rest. I have carried that sentence beside her name for 187 years, and I confess I did not expect to need it again quite so soon after finally being allowed to rest. "I bought a great many extinctions in my life," he said quietly, more to himself than to Keeper. "I told myself I was preserving them, honoring them. I never once asked whether any of them wanted to be preserved as trophies instead of being left the chance to simply keep existing." He straightened, and something in his posture, when he turned back toward the case, had changed in a way even Ressa noticed from across the room. "I am done being a man who only knows how to keep the dead. I would like, for once in my life, to be the reason something stays alive instead. The journey to the Ark's hidden system took 11 days aboard a vessel Ressa procured through channels or Khan had learned, over the years, not to ask too many questions about. A battered independent freighter registered under a name that traced back to no one in particular. Precisely the kind of anonymous, unremarkable ship that drew no attention from compliance patrols scanning for anything grand enough to matter. The freighter smelled of old coolant and older cargo, its corridors narrow and dimly lit, its bunks little more than reinforced shelving, and Orkan found himself, somewhat to his own bemusement, sleeping more soundly aboard it than he had in his own gallery's considerably finer chambers in weeks. He spent much of the journey in the cargo hold beside Keeper's casing, listening to more of Ruth Calloway's life unspool in careful fragments, understanding, with each new memory offered, exactly how much weight the small archive had carried alone through nearly 2 centuries of silence, and feeling, for reasons he still could not fully articulate even to himself, the particular ache of wanting very badly to be worthy of the trust being placed in him. On the 6th day, Ressa found him there, asleep in the hold with the locket cradled against his chest the way a child might hold something precious against a nightmare, and she said nothing about it afterward, though Orkan noticed, in the days that followed, that her manner toward him had softened into something that felt, for the first time in 11 years of professional association, genuinely close to friendship. She used to say something, Keeper offered on the 9th day, unprompted, its golden light softer than Orkan had yet seen it. Before every difficult thing, not a prayer exactly, more a promise she made to herself over and over until it became something she believed without needing to think about it at all. She said, "Hope is not naive. Hope is a decision you keep making even when the evidence tells you to stop." I have held on to that sentence for 187 years, or conves, because it is the only thing I have ever had to offer myself in place of certainty. I find myself hoping now that you will not make me a liar for having finally decided to trust someone again. They reached the outer edge of the hidden system on the 11th day, and it was there, drifting silent and unremarkable among a field of ordinary-looking asteroids that Keeper's archived star charts confirmed were anything but, that the compliance division finally caught up with them. The interceptor vessel that dropped out of transit space directly across their bow was sleek, official, and utterly without ambiguity about its purpose. Its hull marked with the choir's spare, geometric insignia, its calm hail arriving within seconds, cold and procedurally polite in the specific way that made Orkan's blood run colder than any open threat could have managed. Independent freighter, you are ordered to halt and sub him. It to inspection under Species Compliance Authority. We have reason to believe you are transporting contraband relating to culling record 7734B. Non-compliance will be treated as confirmation of intent. Ressa's hands flew across the freighter's aging controls, and Orkan felt the ship shudder as she pushed its engines toward whatever margin of speed the old vessel had left to give. "We can't outrun a compliance interceptor," she said, tight and controlled despite the fear plainly threading through her voice. "Not in this thing. Or Khan, we need a plan that isn't running because running isn't going to work." Behind them, the interceptor's shape grew steadily larger against the starfield, its running lights sharp and cold, and Orkan felt the old, familiar instinct to retreat into calculation rise up in him, the same instinct that had built his career, the part of him that had always known how to price a risk and walk away from the ones that cost too much. He recognized it now for what it was, and for the first time in his adult life, he chose, deliberately, not to listen to it. "Time to intercept," Ressa called out. 90 seconds, maybe less if they push harder." Orkan looked down at Keeper's small casing, cradled carefully in his lap, its golden light pulsing in a rhythm that had, somewhere across the last 11 days, stopped feeling foreign to him and started feeling like something closer to companionship. "Keeper," he said, The Ark's defenses, are they still active after all this time? I do not know with certainty, Keeper admitted. But the coordinates I carry include an activation sequence, meant to be transmitted only by a bonded archive unit in the final approach, designed to lower the Ark's cloak long enough for a verified retrieval to dock safely, and then immediately reconceal the system behind us. If the defenses have degraded across the last 187 years, the sequence may fail entirely. If they have not, it may be the only chance we have of reaching the Ark before that interceptor closes the distance enough to open fire. Then we don't have much of a decision to make, Orkan said, and there was a new steadiness in his voice that surprised even himself, the specific calm of a man who had spent his whole life avoiding risk and had finally, in the space of 11 strange and transformative days, discovered something he considered worth the risk of losing everything else. Send it. All of it. Whatever's left of that sequence, send it now. Keeper's golden light flared bright, brighter than Orkan had yet seen it, pouring outward through the freighter's ancient transmission array in a burst of structured energy that made every display on the bridge flicker and dim, as the ship's system struggled to accommodate a signal architecture never designed for anything built 4 centuries after it. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The interceptor closed the distance behind them, its weapons ports beginning to glow with charging energy, and Orkan found himself gripping Keeper's casing tightly enough that Ressa, glancing back from the pilot's seat, told him afterward she genuinely thought he might crack the brass shell in his grip. Then, ahead of them, the empty field of asteroids shimmered, and one by one, impossibly, began to fade, not vanish exactly, but reveal themselves as something other than they had always appeared, the cloak that had hidden an entire star system for 187 years finally, gratefully, lowering its guard for the first authenticated hand to ask it to in nearly 2 centuries. Beyond the dissolving field, a small, unremarkable yellow star came into view, orbited by a single rocky world, and in high orbit around that world, dark and dormant and larger than Orkan's mind, was fully prepared to process the unmistakable silhouette of an Ark vessel, its hull marked in faded Terran lettering that even his translator needed a moment to fully render. Ark Vessel 7, Meridian's Promise. They named it after her gate, Keeper said, and for the first time since Orkan had opened the locket, its ancient, weary voice cracked with something unmistakably, achingly close to tears. They named it after the place she died holding. I did not know that. I have carried her memory for 187 years, and I did not know they had honored her this way. The Ark's own defenses, ancient but far from dormant, activated in the same instant its cloak fell. A lattice of automated turrets built into the rocky world's orbital ring blazing to sudden, startled life, and turning their attention immediately, decisively, toward the compliance interceptor now caught fully exposed in the open. The interceptor broke off its pursuit within seconds, its calm officer's voice arriving one final time, no longer cold and procedural, but carrying, however faintly, the particular alarm of someone who had just realized they had stumbled into something considerably larger than a routine relic seizure. Unidentified system, unidentified vessel, this is compliance authority, we require immediate. The transmission cut off abruptly as the interceptor broke orbit and fled back toward transit space at a velocity that left no ambiguity about how urgently its crew intended to report what they had just witnessed to whatever authority stood above them. And Orkan understood, watching it go, that the quiet, careful secret Keeper had guarded for nearly 2 centuries had just, irrevocably, stopped being a secret at all. They'll come back, Ressa said quietly, watching the interceptor's retreating engine trail fade into the dark. With more ships, more resources, this isn't over, Orkan. If anything, it's only just started. I know, Orkan said, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that the thought did not frighten him the way he expected it to. But 11,000 people just got a chance to wake up and find out the galaxy didn't finish what it started. Whatever comes next, that's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. The freighter docked with Meridian's promise 4 hours later, guided in by an automated system that recognized Keeper's authentication sequence, and welcomed them with none of the caution Orkan had braced himself for, as though the Ark itself had been waiting, patiently, hopefully, for exactly this moment across every one of the 187 years since its last human visitor had sealed its doors and set its long dormancy in motion. The cryogenic bay, when Orkan finally stood inside it, took his breath away in a manner nothing in his 23 years of collecting extinguished civilizations had ever managed to do. Row upon row of stasis pods stretched into the dim, cold distance, each one holding a sleeping face, peaceful, patient, utterly unaware that the galaxy above them had spent nearly 2 centuries believing their entire species erased from existence. Small placards beneath each pod listed names, ages, occupations, engineers, teachers, children barely old enough to have chosen a life's work at all. An entire cross-section of an ordinary civilization preserved against the day someone brave enough, or perhaps simply foolish enough, would come looking for them. "I would like to wake the senior custodian first," Keeper said, its voice carrying through the bay's ancient but still functional comm system with an authority Orkan had not heard from it before, the voice, he realized, of an intelligence finally, fully returning to the purpose it had been built for. Pod designation Alpha 1. She will know what needs to happen next far better than either of us. The pod hissed open slowly, vapor curling into the cold air, and the woman who emerged from it, gray-haired and weathered and utterly unafraid despite waking into a moment she could not possibly have anticipated, looked first at Orkan's unfamiliar alien features, then at the small brass locket he still carried carefully in his hands, and her eyes, when they found it, filled with a recognition that made Orkan's own throat tighten unexpectedly. "That's Ruth's," she said, her voice rough with the specific ache of disuse. "That's Ruth Calloway's locket. I watched her hand it to the evacuation officer myself, the day before she held the gate." She looked up at Orkan then, searching his face with an intensity that felt, for a strange and vulnerable moment, like being fully seen for the first time in his life. "Who are you? And how, in the name of everything we lost, did you end up carrying the last thing she ever gave anyone?" Orkan Vess, collector of 900 extinctions, a man who had spent 2 decades of his life curating tragedy from a careful, comfortable distance, knelt beside the newly woken stasis pod and found himself, for the first time he could remember, entirely without the polished, practiced answer his profession had trained into him. "I bought her locket at an auction," he said instead, simply, honestly. "I didn't know what I was buying. I think in the end it might have been buying me instead." The weeks that followed transformed Orkan's life in ways he could not have imagined the evening. He'd placed a 400,000 credit bid out of nothing more than wounded pride. Waking 11,000 people from a century and a half of dormancy was not a task accomplished in a single afternoon, and Orkan found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, choosing to stay through nearly all of it rather than returning to the gallery and the reputation and the careful, hollow life he had built for himself among the Thren trading houses. Ressa stayed with him, managing logistics with the same unflappable competence she had always brought to the gallery's business, though Orkan noticed, more than once, the particular light in her eyes when she watched another pod hiss open and another sleeping face blink up into a future none of them had dared to fully expect. The senior custodian, whose name he learned was Elena Marsh, took to Orkan with a wariness that softened only gradually, and understandably so, trusting a Thren, any Thren, after everything her people had survived, was not a thing she owed him simply because he had carried the right locket into the right room at the right time. It was Keeper in the end, who did the most to bridge that distance, sharing with Elena the same careful fragments of Ruth's life it had once shared with Orkan, until the two of them, the woken survivor and the reformed collector, found themselves sitting together some evenings in the colony's makeshift common hall, trading stories about a soldier neither had known personally, but had both, in their own ways, come to love. "She'd have found this funny," Elena said one such evening, gesturing at Orkan with a tired, genuine warmth that had not been there in their first uneasy weeks together. "An alien trophy hunter, of all the people the galaxy could have sent us. Ruth always did have a soft spot for lost causes that turned out to be worth the trouble." "I am attempting," Orkan said, "to be worth the trouble." "You're doing better than you think," Elena told him, and meant it, and something in the way she said it settled in Orkan's chest like a debt finally, quietly beginning to be repaid. Not every part of those early weeks was gentle. Waking from a century and a half of dormancy carried its own quiet cruelties. Survivors who emerged to learn that spouses or siblings placed in different ark vessels during the chaotic final evacuation had never been located. Families who had to grieve losses that, for them, felt only minutes old despite having happened generations before by the calendar of the wider galaxy. Orkan sat with more than one grieving stranger in those weeks, offering nothing but presents, a small and unglamorous gift he had never once thought to offer anyone in 23 years of curating other people's tragedies from behind climate-controlled glass. He found, to his quiet astonishment, that he was not bad at it. The choir did send more ships. Eventually, exactly as Ressa had warned they would, an official delegation, cold and procedurally correct, arriving 3 weeks later to formally investigate the irregularity reported by the fleeing interceptor. Orkan stood on the colony's makeshift landing platform to receive them personally, dressed once more in the polished, deliberate manner of a Threntrade lord, rather than the road-worn traveler he had become across the preceding weeks, understanding, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 2 decades reading a room before it knew what it wanted to say, that the next hour would decide considerably more than his own fate. The delegation's lead officer, a severe, unhurried Thren named Vethais Kor, studied the assembled colony with an expression that gave away nothing, his gaze moving over the makeshift homes, the newly planted gardens, the children, Orkan thought, watching the officer's eyes catch on them and hold there a fraction of a second longer than strict professionalism required, playing in the open square between the stasis hall and the colony's first completed greenhouse. "You understand," Kor said finally, addressing Orkan directly, "that my report will determine whether this population is treated as a discovered remnant subject to standard resolution protocol, or whether it becomes something considerably more complicated for my superiors to manage. I would ask you not to mistake my presence here for sympathy, Collector Vess. I am here to observe facts, nothing more." He paused, his gaze drifting once more across the settlement, taking in the crude but sturdy homes, the irrigation trenches Ressa had helped survey, the faint sound of laughter carrying from somewhere near the greenhouse. "I have read the original culling record for this species. It describes them as unstable, aggressive beyond acceptable tolerance. I confess I am having some difficulty reconciling that description with what I am currently observing." "Then observe them," Orkan said, and found his voice steadier than he expected. "Observe that this is not a hidden weapon cache or a resurgent military threat, whatever your division's older records may have feared humanity capable of becoming again. Observe a colony of farmers, engineers, and teachers, waking into a galaxy that owes them, at minimum, the chance to explain themselves before anyone decides again that they are too dangerous to be allowed to keep existing." Kor said nothing for a long moment, his gaze drifting once more toward the children in the square, and when he finally turned to depart, his parting words carried none of the cold procedural certainty he had arrived with. "My report will state what I observed," he said. "I make no promises beyond that, but I will say this much, Collector Vess, for whatever small comfort it offers you. I have filed a great many resolution reports across my career, and I do not recall ever once before today watching children play in the courtyard of a population my division was sent to evaluate for erasure. I am not certain my superiors will know quite what to do with that detail. I am, I confess, somewhat curious to find out myself. What genuinely turned the tide, however, was not Core's report alone, but the public testimony Khan had spent considerable personal fortune ensuring was already broadcast across a dozen independent networks before the delegation ever arrived, testimony that made it considerably more costly in terms of galactic reputation. For the choir to simply erase 11,000 awakened and very publicly documented survivors, then it would have been to quietly finish what the original culling fleet had started nearly 2 centuries before. It was not, Keeper cautioned him repeatedly, a permanent safety. The choir did not forgive easily, and humanity's survival remained, in the calculus of galactic politics, a fragile and contested thing that would require vigilance for a very long time to come. But it was, undeniably, a beginning. The first one humanity had been given since the day the culling fleets first darkened Terran skies, and Khan found himself, against every instinct his old life had trained into him, determined to see it through. He sold the gallery within the year. Not all of it he kept, deliberately, and with a new sense of purpose he had never once felt toward his old collecting habits, the pieces that genuinely honored the cultures they came from, and arranged for the rest to be returned, wherever possible, to whatever remnant populations of their original species could still be located and consulted. It was Ressa who suggested, gently, that the gallery's remaining resources might be better spent funding exactly the kind of careful, quiet search that had once found Ark Vessel 7. A search for whatever other hidden refuges might still be waiting, scattered and patient, across a galaxy that had spent far too long believing certain doors were meant to stay closed forever. He sold the gallery within the year. Not all of it he kept, deliberately, and with a new sense of purpose he had never once felt toward his old collecting habits, the pieces that genuinely honored the cultures they came from, and arranged for the rest to be returned, wherever possible, to whatever remnant populations of their original species could still be located and consulted. It was Ressa who suggested, gently, that the gallery's remaining resources might be better spent funding exactly the kind of careful, quiet search that had once found Ark Vessel 7. A search for whatever other hidden refuges might still be waiting, scattered and patient, across a galaxy that had spent far too long believing certain doors were meant to stay closed forever. She stayed on to help him build it, that new venture, though neither of them called it a gallery anymore. They called it, in the end, simply the Custodial Trust, a small and unglamorous name for an organization that would, over the following years, locate and quietly assist the awakening of 4 more hidden populations across as many sectors, each discovery a little less dangerous than the last as word of Ark Vessel 7's survival spread and made the choirs older, harsher instincts a little more costly to indulge in public. It was not, Keeper reminded him often, a permanent safety for any of them. The galaxy did not change its habits in a single season simply because one collector had grown a conscience. But it was, undeniably, a beginning, and Khan had come to understand that beginnings were worth more than he had ever given them credit for in his old life of endings carefully preserved behind glass. You could have stayed important, Ressa told him once, months into the Trust's quiet work, the two of them sitting together on the observation deck of a considerably smaller, considerably less anonymous ship than the freighter that had once carried them both toward Ark Vessel 7. The old gallery, the old reputation. You gave up a great deal to become the kind of man who sits up nights with strangers' grief instead. I did not give it up, Khan said, after a moment's consideration. I traded it. I am aware that sounds like the kind of thing a trader would say to make peace with a bad bargain, but I have thought about it a great deal, and I do not believe it was a bad bargain at all. I spent 23 years being important to people who would have forgotten my name within a season of my death. I would rather spend whatever years remain to me being useful to people who will remember, at the very least, that someone finally came looking. He glanced sideways at her, something almost shy in the gesture despite his years and his rank. I do not believe I ever properly thanked you, Ressa, for staying, for the savings you spent without telling me. For 11 years of loyalty, I did very little to earn before I finally deserved it. You're thanking me now, she said, not unkindly. I suppose that will have to do. Orkan kept the locket. He wore it, in fact, on a chain of his own design, close against his chest, in a gesture that would have baffled the version of himself who had bid on it out of nothing more than wounded pride at losing an auction for a glass crown. Keeper remained bonded to it, its golden light a familiar, welcome presence in whatever room Orkan found himself in, and the two of them spent long evenings together still, trading stories, his of the careful, empty life he had built before the auction, hers of Ruth Calloway's stubborn, luminous hope, the two histories slowly, quietly weaving themselves into something neither had quite expected to find. I used to think I understood what it meant to preserve something, Orkan told Keeper one evening, standing on the observation deck of Meridian's Promise, watching the small rocky world below slowly filling with the lights of a colony finally, fully waking into its second chance at existing. I thought preservation was about keeping things behind glass, safe, untouched, frozen exactly as they were at the moment they mattered most. He shook his head slowly, something that might in a Thren face have passed for a rueful smile. I understand now that I had it backward the whole time. The things worth preserving are the ones you let keep changing, growing, making new mistakes and new mornings, the way Ruth always wanted to, before the galaxy decided her species wasn't allowed the chance. She would have liked you, Keeper said quietly, its golden light warm and steady against the dark of the observation glass. I did not expect to say that when you first opened this casing. I have spent nearly 2 centuries testing every hand that came near me, waiting for someone worthy of what I carried. I find now that I was not only testing you for her sake or Vess. I believe, somewhere across these last months, I began testing you for my own as well. And I am glad, more than I have the language to properly express, that you passed. Alina found him there some nights too, in those early weeks, and once, standing beside him at the rail with a mug of something warm cupped in both hands, she asked him a question nobody else had quite thought to ask. "What are you going to do," she said, "when the Trust's work is finished? When every hidden ark that can be found has been found and there's nothing left to go looking for?" Orkan considered the question seriously, the way he considered very few things anymore without first weighing their cost against their worth. "I do not believe that work ever truly finishes," he said finally. "There will always be some quiet corner of the galaxy where a door has been sealed too long, waiting for someone willing to knock. I find, to my own surprise, that I would like to spend the rest of my life being the kind of person who knocks." Alina smiled at that, small and genuine, and said nothing more, and the two of them stood together a while longer in companionable silence, watching the lights of a colony that had waited 187 years for exactly this ordinary, unremarkable evening to finally arrive. Below them, across the rocky world's slowly brightening surface, 11,000 people who had spent 187 years believing they might never wake at all were building homes, planting the first careful seedlings of gardens in soil that had waited patiently, just like they had, for someone to finally come looking. Orkan Vess stood on the observation deck of a ship, named for a gate one woman had died holding, a locket resting warm against his chest that he had once purchased purely out of wounded pride, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the first true thing he had ever known about himself, that he had gone looking for a trophy, and had found instead exactly what he had never known he was missing. He had bought an artifact, out of nothing more than wounded pride and a stranger's engraving that had somehow, impossibly, found its way into his hands at the exact moment he was ready, however unknowingly, to finally become someone worth trusting with it. In every way that mattered more than any glass crown ever could, it had bought him back.